The candle on Nicholas Wycomb's desk had burned down 2 inches since he last moved, and the brandy glass at his elbow had not been touched in 3 hours. Outside, the November wind pressed against the windows of Ashford Park with the patient insistence of something that knew it would eventually get in. Nicholas was 44 years old, though he looked older that evening. Older in the particular way that men who have spent years punishing themselves tend to look, as though the skin has memorized the expression of guilt and simply holds it now. Even in stillness, he was not reading the papers spread before him. He was not doing anything at all. He was sitting in the dim study where his father had sat before him, in a chair that had absorbed 40 years of Wycomb's silences, and he was waiting, though for what he could not have said. When the door opened, she was wearing her traveling cloak. He did not notice the small valise at her feet. He had not looked at her properly in months. 8 years earlier, on that same November night, Charlotte had stood in that doorway for a long moment before she spoke. She was 31 years old and 12 weeks pregnant, and she had spent the afternoon sitting in the drawing room with a physician's letter in her lap, reading it until the words arranged themselves into something she could hold without her hands shaking. The letter had been addressed to her, not to Nicholas. She had answered the door herself, which was unusual enough that she had known, before she opened it, that the news would be of a kind she would not want the household to overhear. She had folded the letter and placed it in the small leather case she kept in the drawer of her writing table. Then she had sat for 2 hours and thought about what it meant and what she intended to do with it, and she had arrived at a decision that felt, in the moment, like the bravest thing she had ever chosen. In the years afterward, she would not always be certain it was brave. But she had made it, and she had kept it, and so there she was in the doorway of his study at 9:30 in the evening, watching her husband stare through the papers on his desk, and she had said his name twice before he looked up. Charlotte. He said it as though recalling a word in a language he had once known. "I wanted to say good night," she said. It was not what she had intended to say. She had intended to say a great many things. To sit across from him and begin, carefully, the conversation that the physician's letter required. But she looked at his face in the candlelight and saw a man she no longer recognized, and the words she had prepared arranged themselves back into silence. Nicholas looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his desk. "I'm tired of looking at you," he said. The sentence landed in the room without drama. He said it the way a man says something he believes to be a private thought, without venom, without intent, with only the flat exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that he has forgotten the carrying is unusual. He meant himself. He had spent 6 months drinking and becoming his father, and hating the man Charlotte was looking at every time she entered a room. And what he meant, in that moment, was that he could not bear to see his own reflection in her concern. He did not know she could hear it any other way. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. She closed the door very quietly behind her. Nicholas sat for a while longer. The candle guttered. He told himself she had gone upstairs. He told himself that in the morning he would find the words he could not locate tonight, that there was time, that there was always time. He poured the brandy down his throat and poured another and sat with it untouched, and told himself the same things in a different order. The fire burned down to ash. It was her maid who came to him at midnight, a young woman named Polly, who had been with Charlotte since before the marriage, who appeared in the corridor outside the study with her eyes red and her cap askew, and who said, in a voice that was trying very hard not to break, "My lord, I cannot find her ladyship anywhere." He searched the house himself. Every room, every corridor, the kitchen, garden, the stables. Her horse was still in its stall. The small valise he had not noticed in the doorway was gone. Nothing else was missing. No trunk, no hat box, nothing that would suggest a planned departure. Only the small case and the woman who had closed the door quietly behind her. And by 3 in the morning, Nicholas Wycombe was standing in the entrance hall of Ashford Park with a lamp in his hand. and the absolute certainty, arriving with the slow weight of something that had always been true. That he had done this. He had done this, and she was gone, and he had not even looked up properly to watch her go. 8 years passed. Nicholas dismissed his valet at the end of the first year and hired another. He dismissed the second and kept the third. He stopped drinking in the February after Charlotte left, stopped with the particular ferocity of a man who has decided that the decanter is the enemy and has declared war on it. And the sobriety held. It held through the spring and the summer, and through the second anniversary of Charlotte's departure, which he marked by walking the full perimeter of the estate at dawn, and returning to find his steward waiting at the door with 3 letters requiring his signature. He ran Ashford Park with a precision that his tenants respected, and his neighbors found slightly unnerving. He refused 4 marriage proposals on behalf of 4 young women whose mothers had presented them with varying degrees of subtlety. He did not explain his refusals. He did not need to. Everyone in the county knew what the Marquess of Ashford had done to his wife, or believed they did, and Nicholas found it convenient to let them believe it, because the alternative, explaining that he did not know what he had done, that she had simply left, that he had searched and found nothing and received no word, felt like an excuse he had not earned the right to make. He thought of her often. He thought of the 3 years before the 4th year, the years when he had been a different man entirely, present, attentive, genuinely in love with the woman he had married. He thought of her hand in his at a tedious dinner party, early in their marriage, when he had reached across under the tablecloth and taken her wrist and pressed 2 fingers to her pulse, as though checking it, and she had looked at him with an expression of such suppressed amusement that he had lost track of whatever the man to his left was saying. He had kissed the inside of her wrist at the table. She had been scandalized and delighted in equal measure. He thought of that moment with a regularity that he recognized as unhealthy and could not stop. His mother, the Dowager Marchioness, died in early spring of the 8th year, quietly, in her sleep, in the room she had occupied for 40 years. Nicholas arranged the funeral with the same precision he applied to everything, and went through the house afterward, with the particular emptiness of a man who has been preparing for a grief and finds, when it arrives, that preparation was not the same thing as readiness. 3 weeks after the funeral, a solicitor arrived at Ashford Park. He was a small, careful man named Mr. Henshaw, who had handled the Dowager's private affairs for 11 years, and he came into the study carrying a locked box of polished mahogany, roughly the size of a hat case. He set it on Nicholas's desk, produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, and placed the key beside the box without unlocking it himself. Her ladyship's instructions, Mr. Henshaw said, were that this be delivered to you personally, unopened, following her death. She was very specific on the point of timing. What is in it? Nicholas asked. Letters, Mr. Henshaw said. I have not read them. I was instructed not to. I was instructed only to deliver the box and the key, and to tell you that the correspondence within spans approximately 8 years, and that the first letter is dated December of the year the Marchioness departed. Nicholas looked at the box for a long moment. Thank you, he said. You may go. He waited until he heard the front door close before he touched the key. The letters were in Charlotte's handwriting. He would have known it anywhere. The particular slope of her capital letters, the way she formed the letter A with a small curl at the top. They were arranged in chronological order, tied with a piece of blue ribbon, and there were 32 of them. Quarterly correspondence, spanning 8 years. His mother had known. His mother had known where Charlotte was, and had kept it, and had kept it, and had kept it until she was past the point of being asked to explain herself. He read the first letter standing up. He sat down on the 3rd page. The line was simple. The child arrived safely, and I have named her Anne. Nicholas sat with the box open on his desk until the fire went out. He did not move to add coal. He did not reach for the lamp when the candle burned low. He sat in the dark with 32 letters in his wife's handwriting, and the knowledge that he had a daughter who was 7 years old, and whose name was Anne, and he did not weep, and he did not speak, and he did not do anything at all for a very long time. At 6 in the morning he called for his horse. 3 days on the road brought him to the coast of Cornwall, and the coast of Cornwall brought him, by way of a fisherman in Penzance, who knew everyone within 10 miles, to the village of Mousehole, and the village of Mousehole brought him to a whitewashed cottage at the end of a lane that smelled of gorse and salt, and something he could not name but which registered, somewhere below thought, as home. He stood on the step holding his hat. He had not planned what to say. He had driven for 3 days on the momentum of the box and the letters and the line on the 3rd page, and now he was here, and the door was in front of him, and he understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that he had not the faintest idea what he was doing. He knocked. Charlotte opened the door. She was 39 years old, and she looked it in the best possible way. Steadier than he remembered, the particular steadiness of someone who has learned to rely entirely on herself and found, to her own surprise, that she was sufficient. Her hair was simply dressed. She was wearing a gray wool dress that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with practicality. She looked at him for 1 full second without any expression at all, and then she stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind her so that the child inside would not hear. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Your mother's solicitor," Nicholas said, "after her death, 3 weeks ago." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not softened exactly, but reorganized, as though she were rearranging the furniture of her understanding to accommodate a new piece of information. "She told you," Charlotte said. "She left me a box of your letters, 32 of them. She did not tell me herself. She was past telling anyone anything by the time I received them." He paused. "I am sorry for your loss. She was fond of you." The letters made that clear. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The wind off the sea moved through the gorse at the edge of the lane. "You may take a room at the village inn," she said at last. "You may stay as long as you choose. I will not deny you the right to know whether a daughter exists. She does, and she is well. And her name is Anne, as I expect you know. But you will not cross the threshold of this house until I decide you may. Those are my terms. You are welcome to dispute them." "I won't dispute them," Nicholas said. "I haven't finished." Charlotte met his eyes directly, and there was nothing apologetic in the look. "Anne does not know who you are. She will not be told until I am certain it is safe to tell her. Safe for her, not for you. Is that clear?" "Completely," he said. "Then we understand each other." She reached for the door handle. "Is there anything else?" Nicholas looked at her for a moment. "Do you want me to leave entirely?" he asked. "If that is what you want, I will go. I will not come back." Charlotte was still for a long moment. The wind moved through the gorse again. Down the lane, a gull called once and fell silent. "I do not know yet," she said, with a difficulty that was visible in the slight tension around her mouth and nowhere else. "That is the most honest answer I can give you." He nodded once. Then he walked back down the lane toward the village without arguing, and Charlotte stood on the step and watched him go, and did not move until the sound of his footsteps had faded entirely. The village of Mousehole was small enough that a stranger attracted notice, and Nicholas was careful about the kind of notice he attracted. He took a room at the inn, a clean, low-ceilinged room overlooking the harbor, and he established a routine that was deliberately quiet. He walked in the mornings. He took his meals alone. He asked no one about Charlotte because he understood that she had built something here, and that the architecture of it was none of his business until she decided it was. He learned about her life anyway, the way you learn things in a small place, by being present and paying attention. He learned that she taught 3 mornings a week at the small school near the church, and that the children were fond of her in the particular way. Children are fond of teachers who do not condescend to them. He learned that her closest friend was an old fisherwoman named Mrs. Penrose, who had a face like a cliff and a laugh that carried across the harbor, and who seemed to regard Charlotte with the uncomplicated affection of someone who had decided, long ago, that this woman was worth knowing. On the 2nd day, walking the cliff path above the village in heavy wind, he saw Anne. She was 100 yards ahead of him on the path. too close to the edge, not recklessly so, but close enough that the wind was a concern, and she was 7 years old and absorbed in something she was examining on the ground, and Nicholas felt something move through him that was entirely unlike anything he had felt before. He did not call out. He was afraid that if she turned suddenly toward his voice, she would step wrong, and he was also afraid, in a way he could not entirely account for, of frightening her. So he walked parallel to the path along the grass above it, keeping her in sight, saying nothing. Charlotte arrived from the other direction, 2 minutes later, moving quickly with the purposeful stride of someone who has counted the minutes since a child left her sight. She reached Anne and crouched down beside her, and whatever she said made the child laugh. Then she stood, and she and Anne walked back along the path together, and as they passed Nicholas, who had stopped a few feet from the gate at the path's end, Charlotte did not acknowledge him. The wind took her shawl. It happened in a second. A gust from the sea caught the wool and lifted it clear off her shoulders, and it was heading for the cliff edge before Nicholas had consciously decided to move. He caught it with one hand, the wool rough and salt-damp against his palm, and walked back to the gate where Charlotte was standing with Anne beside her, and held it out. Charlotte took it. Their hands did not touch. "Thank you," she said, in the tone of a woman accepting something from a stranger. "Of course," Nicholas said. Annie looked at him with the frank, measuring assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise curiosity as politeness. She was dark-haired, like Charlotte. She had his eyes. He had not been prepared for that. "Come," Charlotte said to her daughter, and they walked up the lane to the cottage, and Nicholas stood at the gate until they were inside. Each night at the inn, he wrote a letter to Charlotte. He wrote about the things he had thought about during 8 years of silence, about his brother, about the drinking, about the particular quality of the guilt he had carried, about what he should have said and when and how. He wrote carefully and at length, and when he had finished, he folded each letter and carried it to the grate and burned it, because he had not been given permission to send her anything, and because the letters were not, he suspected, the kind of thing she needed from him right now. They were the kind of thing he needed to write. On the 7th day, a note arrived at the inn. It was in Charlotte's handwriting, 3 words on a folded piece of paper. Sunday service. The back pew. Do not approach. He was at St. Buryan's before the bell stopped ringing. The church was old stone and salt air, and the congregation was small enough that Nicholas's presence at the back was noticed and, with the polite discretion of Cornish Methodism, ignored. He sat in the back pew and watched Charlotte and Anne settle in their usual place 3 rows from the front, and he did not look away for the entire service, not because he was cataloging or assessing, but because after 8 years of a face known only in memory, the fact of her in a room was something he could not take for granted. After the service, on the path between the gravestones, Anne stopped. She turned and pointed at him with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that pointing is rude, and she asked her mother, "Who is that man?" Charlotte knelt down. Nicholas, 2 paces behind, moved without thinking, placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, steadying her, asking permission in the only way available to him. Charlotte did not move away. She answered her daughter without looking up. "He is a friend of your grandmother's," she said. "He has come a long way." "Why?" Anne pressed. "Because she was important to him," Charlotte said, "and he wanted to pay his respects." Anne considered this with the same measuring expression he had seen on the cliff path, then apparently decided he was acceptable, and took her mother's hand and walked toward the gate. Nicholas stood among the gravestones for a moment longer, Charlotte's shoulder still warm against the memory of his palm. The following Sunday, a note arrived at the inn before breakfast. Tea at the cottage. Tuesday at 2, while Anne is at her lessons. Come to the side door. The cottage parlor was small and low-ceilinged and full of the particular warmth of a room that has been lived in by someone who knows exactly how they like it. Books on every surface. A child's drawing pinned above the fireplace, a house and a sea, and 3 figures that might have been people or might have been birds. A cat asleep in the chair by the window, which did not move when Nicholas entered and showed no intention of doing so. Charlotte poured the tea herself and sat across from him and said nothing for a moment, which was not uncomfortable. The way silence between strangers is uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people deciding where to begin. "She doesn't know," Charlotte said at last. "Anne. She has asked about her father twice, and both times I told her that he lived far away and that I would explain when she was older. She accepted that. She is a practical child." A pause. "She has your eyes. I noticed," Nicholas said. "I'm not telling you that as a gift," Charlotte said. "I'm telling you because you should know what you're walking into if I decide to let you walk into it. She is 7 years old and she has a life here and friends and a routine that works, and I will not disrupt any of that on the strength of your good intentions. I understand. Do you?" Charlotte looked at him directly. 8 years in Hampshire, Nicholas. 8 years as a Marcus in mourning, with a house and a staff and a county that felt sorry for you. I had Anne and £30 and a reference from the vicar of a parish I had attended twice. She set her cup down. "I am not saying this to wound you. I am saying it because I think you need to understand the difference in what we each did with those 8 years before you decide what you're owed." Nicholas was quiet for a moment. "I'm not here because I think I'm owed anything," he said. "I'm not certain why I'm here, except that she is 7 years old, and her name is Anne, and I read that on the 3rd page of a letter, and I was on the road by 6 in the morning. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Then stay as long as you need to. But Anne sets her own pace. That is not negotiable." "I know," Nicholas said. "I agree." He sat in the small parlor of the life she had built without him and looked at the child's drawing above the fireplace, and something settled in him. Not comfortably, but with the specific gravity of a man who has finally understood the true dimensions of a thing he has been measuring wrong for years. Anne fell ill on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Nicholas arrived in Mousehole. It began as a cough and became a fever by nightfall, and by 10 in the evening, the cottage windows were lit and Charlotte had sent the girl for the girl who helped with the housework for the physician, and Nicholas, who had been walking back from the harbor when he saw the lights, stopped at the end of the lane and stood there for a long time. He could not go in. Those were the terms, and he had agreed to them, and they were reasonable terms, and he had no intention of breaking them. He walked to the low stone wall at the edge of the cottage garden and sat down on it instead, and he stayed there. The night was cold and clear, with a half moon that gave enough light to see by. The sea was audible but not visible, a steady sound at the bottom of the dark. At midnight, the physician's trap came back down the lane, and the physician touched his hat to Nicholas as he passed, which suggested that the news was not catastrophic, and Nicholas let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. At 2 in the morning, the cottage door opened. Charlotte came out carrying a cup of tea. She crossed the garden without hurrying and sat down on the wall beside him without speaking, and held out the cup, and he took it. They sat in silence. The moon moved. The sea continued its steady commentary on the dark. At some point, Nicholas could not have said when, Charlotte's hand found his on the cold stone between them, and they stayed like that, neither of them speaking, until the sky began to lighten in the east, and the first birds started their noise in the gorse. "The fever broke at first light," Charlotte said, and stood and went inside. He walked back to the inn in the early morning and sat on his bed without sleeping and thought about her hand on the cold stone, and did not try to make it mean anything beyond what it was, because what it was seemed, already, like more than he had any right to claim. The village had been politely incurious about the stranger at the inn for 3 weeks, but small places have their own intelligence, and by the 4th week it was generally known that the man at the anchor was the Marchioness's husband. The information moved through Mousehole with the quiet efficiency of a tide, and the result was that Mrs. Trevithick, the vicar's wife, appeared at Charlotte's cottage on a Wednesday morning, with a cake she had not needed to bake and a question she had clearly been composing for several days. "I am not here to tell you what to do," Mrs. Trevithick said, sitting across from Charlotte at the kitchen table, with the cake between them. I want to be clear about that. Then what are you here to do? Charlotte asked. To ask you a plain question, because I am your friend and I think you need someone to ask it. Mrs. Trevithick folded her hands. What do you intend? Charlotte was quiet. Because he has been here 4 weeks, Mrs. Trevithick continued, and he sits on that wall at night when Anne is ill, and he caught your shawl off the cliff path, and half the village has seen him in the back pew at St. Buryan's, and the other half has heard about it, and you have not sent him away. So I am asking, what do you intend? I don't know yet, Charlotte said. That is not an answer. No, Charlotte agreed. It isn't. She looked at the cake for a moment, then at her friend. 8 years ago, I made a decision that I believed was the right one, and I have spent every year since then being less and less certain that it was. And now he is here, and Anne is here, and I cannot. She stopped. I cannot see how to put those two things in the same room without one of them breaking. Mrs. Trevithick was quiet for a moment. Which one are you afraid will break? She asked. Charlotte did not answer. But the question stayed with her long after Mrs. Trevithick had gone home, and it was still there when Nicholas came to the cottage 2 days later and knocked at the side door and told her he had to go to Hampshire. A tenant matter, he said. It requires my signature. I'll be back within a fortnight. He paused. If you would prefer that I not return, write to me at Ashford. I won't come back without your permission. Charlotte looked at him. Is that what you want? She asked. To not come back? No, Nicholas said. It came out simply, without drama, as though he had stopped rehearsing. No, I want to come back. I wanted to say that plainly, because I don't think I've said anything plainly in a very long time. Charlotte nodded once. Go to Hampshire, she said. I'll think while you're gone. Ashford Park received him with the silence of a house that has been kept but not inhabited, and Nicholas moved through it with the particular discomfort of a man who has spent 4 weeks in a whitewashed cottage and finds his own estate suddenly excessive. He dealt with the tenant matter in a morning. He spent the afternoon in his study, which was where he found the box. It was a small thing, a pasteboard box that had lived on the shelf above his desk for 8 years without his ever opening it, because it had been there when Charlotte left, and he had told himself, without examination, that it contained her sewing things or some other domestic item he had no business disturbing. He opened it now, in the afternoon light, and found that it contained a pair of gloves, a dried flower of some kind he could not identify, a small ivory miniature of her mother, and a letter. The letter was in Charlotte's handwriting, dated the morning of the night she left. It began, Nicholas, I have something I must tell you, and I do not know how. Anne stopped. He stood at his desk and read those 11 words for a very long time. He read them until he understood what they meant. Not what the words said, which was simple enough, but what they required him to revise. She had not left in anger. She had not left because he had driven her out with the line, or not only for that reason, or not in the way he had spent 8 years believing. She had been trying to tell him something on the morning of the night she left, and she had not been able to find the words, and then something had happened and she had gone, and whatever she had been trying to tell him was still in that letter, unfinished, waiting. He returned to Cornwall 2 days early. He did not contact Charlotte when he arrived. He took his room at the inn and he sat with what he knew, which was less than he had thought he knew that morning, and more than he had known for 8 years, and he waited, because she had said she would think while he was gone, and he had no right to hurry her. On the 4th day back, a note arrived at the inn in Charlotte's handwriting. Tonight, after Anne is asleep. The cottage parlor was firelit and quiet. When Charlotte let him in, Anne was asleep upstairs. He could hear the particular silence of a house with a sleeping child in it, the way it settles differently than a house without one. Charlotte did not offer him a chair. She stood with her back to the fire and her hands at her sides, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing something and has decided, finally, to abandon the rehearsal and simply speak. The afternoon of the night you said what you said, Charlotte began, I received a letter from a physician. Nicholas was still. I was 12 weeks pregnant, she said. I had known for 3 weeks and I had not told you, because I was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving. She paused. The letter told me that there was a complication, a specific one, which he described in terms I will not repeat because they are not relevant now. What is relevant is that he told me it was likely I would lose either the baby or my life. He could not tell me which. The fire shifted. Nicholas did not move. I sat with that letter for 2 hours, she said, and I thought about what it would mean to tell you. I thought about watching you make that choice, whether to grieve me or grieve the child, and I could not do it. Not because I thought you incapable of bearing it, but because I thought it would destroy you, and you were already so close to destroyed. She looked at him steadily. I thought I was protecting you. I believed that when I got into the carriage. By the time I reached the first post-in, I was less certain. Charlotte, he began. Let me finish, she said. The complication resolved. Against the odds, against the physician's expectation, it resolved. And Anne was born safely and I survived. And by that point, I had been gone 4 months. And I could not imagine what letter I could write that would not sound like a manipulation. Look, I have survived. Here is your daughter. Please forgive me. So I stayed silent, and then a year passed, and then another, and then 5. She stopped. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you because Anne deserves a father who knows the truth, regardless of what you decide to do with it. Nicholas sat down. He sat down on the small sofa against the wall, and he put his hands on his knees and he wept. Not quietly, not turned away, not with any of the dignified restraint that 44 years of being a Marquess had equipped him with. He wept plainly, on the small sofa in the cottage parlor, for the years he had spent believing himself a monster, who had driven out a wife he loved, for his brother who had died on a gray morning in October, while Nicholas watched from 20 yards away and could not reach him in time, for the daughter who had been alive and growing for 7 years while he ran the estate impeccably and refused to remarry and told himself it was penance. He wept for the half-finished letter on the shelf above his desk that he had never opened, for the 3 years before the 4th year when he had been a different man, for the wrist he had kissed at a dinner table, and the expression on her face that he had carried in memory for 8 years as the last clear image of who they had been to each other. Charlotte did not move. She did not come to him, and she did not look away. When he could speak, he looked up at her. The night I said that, he said, I meant myself. Charlotte was very still. I had spent 6 months becoming my father, Nicholas said. I watched my brother die, and I climbed inside a decanter, and I stayed there. And every time you came into a room, I could see what I had become reflected in the way you looked at me. I was tired of looking at what I had become. I was tired of seeing it in your face. He stopped. I know you had no reason to know that. I know there was no way to hear it as anything other than what it sounded like. And I am not telling you this so that you will forgive me. I am telling you because you have spent 8 years carrying a version of that night that was not true, and you deserve to know the true one. Charlotte sat down in the chair across from him. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the fire for a long moment. I have also spent 8 years not forgiving myself, she said at last, for leaving without telling you, for staying silent when I should have written, for letting you believe something that was not entirely true. She was quiet. I don't know that either of us has very much ground to stand on. No, Nicholas agreed. Then I will tell you my terms, Charlotte said, and you will tell me whether you can keep them. She met his eyes. Complete sight or nothing. I will not do this halfway, and I will not do it in secret, and I will not pretend to Anne that you are anything other than what you are. She sets her own pace. You do not push, you do not press, you do not try to buy her affection with presents or promises. You show up, consistently, and you let her decide. Yes, Nicholas said, all of it, yes, and if at any point it becomes clear that your presence is hurting her, then I go, he said, without argument. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and stood, and walked to the window, and he understood that the conversation was over, not ended badly, but finished, the way a thing is finished when it has been said completely. He was at the door when she spoke again. Nicholas. He turned. I will tell Anne in the morning, Charlotte said. "Come to the garden at 10. The cliff path above the cottage was empty at dawn, and Charlotte was already there when Nicholas arrived, standing at the edge where the gorse fell away to the sea below, watching the light come up over the water. Neither of them had slept. The air was cold and clean, and the sea was the color of pewter, turning gold. They stood side by side without speaking for a while, and then Nicholas said quietly, "I don't know how to be a father to a 7-year-old who has never met me." Charlotte turned to look at him. "You'll learn the same way I did," she said. "Badly at first, and then better." And then she kissed him, once, slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone who has considered all the alternatives and arrived at a decision. Not a return to something lost. A choice made in full sight of everything it cost. Anne met him in the cottage garden on a Tuesday morning, in the particular way children meet things they have been told about. With a combination of prior knowledge and fresh assessment, measuring the reality against the description, Charlotte told her plainly, without softening it, "This is your father. He has been away a long time, and he has come to know you. If you would like to know him." Annie studied him for a long moment with his own eyes in her face. "Do you like to draw?" she asked. "I don't," Nicholas said, "but I would like to learn." She turned the answer over in her mind. Then she went inside and fetched her paper. The autumn passed in the way that important things sometimes pass. Not quickly, but with a sense of accumulation, each small moment building on the last, until the sum of them was something neither of them had planned. Anne drew him in pencil on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in the garden with his coat off, and presented the drawing to him with the frank assessment of an artist who knows the work is accurate if not flattering. He kept it in the inside pocket of his coat. On a Thursday in October, Charlotte and Nicholas walked the cliff path alone for the first time. Anne at her lessons, the sea below them gray and restless, and Nicholas told her about his brother. He had not told anyone before. He told her about the morning in October 8 years ago, the riding accident he had witnessed and could not prevent, the particular quality of helplessness that had preceded the drinking. And Charlotte listened without interrupting, and when he had finished she said only, "I know. I could see it happening, and I didn't know how to reach you. It was not absolution. It was something more useful. The simple recognition that they had both been in the room, both failing, both alone. In November, he asked whether he might write to her between visits. "Yes," she said. "Write." In February, on a cold morning with snow threatening on the horizon, Charlotte appeared at the inn while he was finishing his breakfast and sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "Would you like us to come to Hampshire?" Nicholas set down his cup. "Yes," he said. "Very much. Then we'll come in spring," Charlotte said, "when the roads are better." They came in April, when the gorse was in flower on the Cornwall cliffs, and the Hampshire lanes were running with the particular green of an English spring that makes everything look new and slightly improbable. Charlotte and Anne arrived at Ashford Park in the late afternoon, and Nicholas was at the gate. Not in the entrance hall, not at the top of the steps, but at the gate, where he had been for the past half hour, without being able to explain why. Anne got out of the carriage first and looked at the house with the frank appraisal she applied to everything, and said, "It's very large." "It is," Nicholas agreed. "Do you know all the rooms?" "Most of them," he said. "Can I see the ones you don't know?" Charlotte stepped down from the carriage and stood beside him as Anne walked ahead of them toward the house, already exploring, already measuring the place against some internal standard she had not yet disclosed. "She's going to reorganize everything," Charlotte said. "Good," said Nicholas. It needed it. The estate was unrecognizable from what it had been 8 years ago. Not in its bones, which were the same stone and timber they had always been, but in its spirit. Nicholas had rebuilt it sober, room by room, against a future he had not believed he had, and the result was a house that felt, for the first time in his memory, like somewhere a person might actually want to live. In the library at dusk, after Anne had gone to bed and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Charlotte closed the book she had been reading and looked at the fire, and Nicholas extinguished the lamp. The room was warm and dark except for the low glow of the coals, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was entirely different from the silences of 8 years ago. Full rather than empty, chosen rather than imposed. The morning came with clean light through the library windows, and Nicholas was at his desk when he found it. The half-finished letter, Charlotte's handwriting, dated 8 years ago. It had been placed on his desk at some point in the night, completed. The familiar slope of her letters continued past the point where they had always stopped. Past Nicholas, "I have something I must tell you, and I do not know how," and went on for 3 more pages. And he read all of it in the morning light, the physician's letter, and the fear, and the road to Cornwall, and the years of silence, and the daughter, and the slow, difficult journey back toward the man she had loved before grief had made him someone else. The letter ended with a single line, written in the same careful hand, in ink that was still faintly fresh. "I am coming home." Nicholas sat with the letter until the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and Anne's drawing of 3 figures on a cliff, pinned above the mantel where the family portrait used to hang, caught the light and held it. Outside, somewhere in the house, a child's voice asked a question, and a woman's voice answered it, and the sound of them moved through Ashford Park like something that had always belonged there and had simply, at last, found its way in.